Hi, I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here. So before I launch into this week's episode, I just want to mention a trigger warning as my guest this week talks about sexual abuse. In the episode, we don't go into the details of the specific abuse. However, the episode may still be triggering for you. So if you or someone you know has experienced abuse and you think this is not the right time to listen to this episode, you might want to give this episode a miss and maybe come back to it at a later date, or maybe not listen at all. So today I'm talking to Patty Cabot, author of the book Not That Girl Anymore, and someone who is passionate about raising awareness around sexual abuse. Starting in her teens, Patty battled drastic weight fluctuations and thought it was what prevented her from having romantic relationships. And desperate to break the cycle and open herself to love, at age 38, she started working with a therapist specialising in eating disorders. And the therapist believed Patty's weight changes and her relationship with food were a symptom of childhood sexual abuse. And only by resolving it could she have the love she wanted. So in the episode today, Patty talks about sexual abuse and the link with eating disorders. She explores the shame and secrecy experienced by sufferers, and she talks us through her healing journey and the different therapies that helped her, along with meditation and other tools. Patty shows incredible tenacity and resilience in healing, walking a therapy journey that spanned 12 years. But she has emerged on the other side with deep self-awareness, has healed her relationship with food, and is open-hearted and feeling her emotions in a way that she never dreamed possible. This is a truly inspiring episode about what is possible with healing. Let's get to the conversation. So before I delve into this week's episode, I just want to let you know that I've started writing on Substack. So if you would like to read about eating disorders and disordered eating, if you want tips and skills from the therapy room, if you want to improve your relationship with food, I'm going to be writing twice a week on Substack. You can subscribe there and get my regular articles. And for every article I am writing, I'm also doing an audio to accompany it. So it's almost like a little extra free podcast. If you are interested to subscribe, do go to the link in the show notes and you can sign up, and hope to see some of you over there. Hi, Patty. Welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast.
Hi, Harriet. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Oh, so Patty, you're saying that you're in New York, New York City. So can you just tell us a little bit about the Indian summer that you're having at the moment?
Yes, it's beautiful here. So it's 80 degrees and sunny, which is much warmer than normal. So it's beautiful. And we've been having a lot of hurricanes in different parts of the country. So unfortunately, a lot of people are really suffering, but it's gorgeous here. So
long may it continue. So, Patty, could I firstly get you to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. My name is Patty Cabot. I live in New York City, as we were just talking about. And I was interested in being on your podcast, Harriet, because you're the eating disorder therapist. And I know you know a little bit about my story, but I started having some drastic weight fluctuations starting in my teens, where I would gain or lose 50 to 75 pounds every 2 years. And I did it like clockwork for 20 years. And I couldn't figure out why. I just could not crack the code. I was a fantastic dieter, but I could never maintain the weight loss. And I finally, at the age of 38, I kind of had this realization that I was going to be trapped in this endless cycle forever unless I figured out why I kept doing it, because it really was unknown to me why I kept going through this constant cycle of up and down and up and down and up and down. And it was really at that point I started working with a therapist who specialized in eating disorders. And for anybody who has not been in therapy, one of the things that you do when you start therapy is you kind of go through your history, so they have a sense of your life and, the things that happen to you and what kind of makes you who you are and brings you to where you are. And as we were going through, I told her about I was sexually abused as a child, which I was always aware of, never dealt with, never thought about. Kind of it happened. It was what it was. I was young. It was primarily my stepfather, and my mother and my stepfather divorced shortly before my 11th birthday. We moved across the country, and I really was out of sight, out of mind. So when I told my therapist about this, she really said to me, she was like, your weight is just a symptom of that. And until you deal with that, you're always going to be struggling with your weight. It was at that point where I was like, wow, I'm literally, Harriet, I could have had 100 years and I was never going to make the connection between the two.
So it sounds like it was a real revelation and surprise almost when you were with your therapist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really did go into therapy, like wanting to crack the code on my weight, which I did. And I will say to you, in all honesty, managing my weight became the easiest part of it, which is not to say that I wasn't still tormented by the way I looked and I had my own struggles with food that went on for years while I was in therapy. But really, once we started dealing with the abuse, it did become the easiest part to manage.
So can you say a bit more about perhaps how the eating disorder was linked to that abuse and a bit more? Because
Sure.
it sounds like it was almost like a bit of a metaphor, was it? Almost what was happening in your life? What happened to you as a little girl?
Yeah, and I think there's so many things in there that you just said that I'm like, that was smart. I want to talk about that. One of the things that I want to start out with is that no matter what kind of trauma you have, people suppress trauma. Like whatever bad thing happens to us, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, whatever it is, we tamp it down. Nobody wants to deal with the horrible things that happen to us. It's just kind of like human nature. We tamp it down. But just because it's tamped down doesn't mean that it's not still bubbling underneath the surface, kind of motivating you and driving your behaviors in ways that may be unseen. And I think it's really interesting about, and again, I'm 58 now, so when I started therapy, it was 20 years ago, and the world has changed a lot in 20 years in terms of what kinds of information is available. I mean, it's a sea change from what it had been. And even now, if you look, there's not a strong amount of information about the correlation between eating disorders and sexual abuse of children, but they really do go hand in hand. And I would say that really extends to no matter what your vehicle of choice is to self-soothe and to medicate, because food is no different than alcohol or drugs or gambling or anything else that is a distraction to free you up from thinking about the thing you don't ever want to think about. They operate in the same way. And I will say that when I really started to do kind of a deeper dive about like, why isn't there anything about childhood sexual abuse and eating disorders? Like, why couldn't I find anything? I mean, the information, the statistics are shocking. So 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused by the age of 18, which is horrifying. 42 million Americans, again, I'm in America, 42 million Americans have been sexually abused. 29 million have an eating disorder, and they often go hand in hand. Again, trauma is looking for a way to medicate. I think there's lots of correlations between, again, alcoholism, drug addiction, all of these things, ways to medicate ourselves.
Yeah, no, so interesting. I think it's sort of shocking actually when you hear those statistics, because I think even in this day and age with all this information around, I think we still tend to think of sexual abuse as something that's kind of quite rare and doesn't really happen as much as it does. And I guess those statistics are very striking, actually.
I think it's shocking and not funny. Funny is not the right word, but it is absolutely appalling to me that in this day and age, childhood sexual abuse is still the taboo that shall not be spoken. I mean, it is the most shameful of the shameful. And I do not mean to pick on the church, because it happens in every religion. It happens in every sporting organization. It happens in every school. It happens everywhere. That 1 in 3, if you're with 3 people, look left, look right, it's one of you. I mean, it's so prevalent. And yet we still don't talk about it. And we still have this insistence that it's not us. It's not our community. It's not our world. It's somebody else. And that is absolutely not true. And there's always this great emphasis on stranger danger. 90% of children that are sexually abused are abused by someone they know because they have proximity to them. So whether it's a relative, a neighbor, a clergyman, it doesn't matter who it is. It's somebody who has access to them.
That is really shocking, isn't it, as well? Because I think the fact that it's often for a child by someone that they know, there's often a likelihood then, isn't there, as well, that other people may get a sense of what is going on. I think there's a lot of avoidance, isn't there, and denial about these things.
Oh, absolutely. I think we shut our eyes to what we don't want to see. which is horrible. And I think it really does happen all the time. I mean, one of the things, I really have not had many conversations with my mother about what happened. And to my mother's great credit, I think she could have done better. But one of the great things she did is she divorced my stepfather. And I had ultimately been in therapy for sexual abuse, and I was with other people who had been abused as children. There were still people in there where their mothers were married to the perpetrators. So it's literally choosing the abuser over your own child, which is heartbreaking. It's shocking, but people don't see what they don't want to see. And again, because of my age, I'm willing to give my mother a little bit of slack because it was a different time, which does not excuse it, but it makes it a little bit more understandable. But the one conversation I had with my mother, she told me my stepfather hit on her mother, her sister, her best friend, everyone. Why did these people not take a look around and say, what else is going on in that family?
Yeah. No,
So yeah, I think there's always people who can see or don't see, and it's heartbreaking when people tell their stories, and who knows and who doesn't know, and who's just going to pretend it's not happening. And I think that's what children do. You pretend it's not happening.
Yeah, and I think for children, I guess there's so much shame, isn't there? And perhaps not an understanding even about what's going on. So there might be a sense that this isn't quite right.
It's deeply shameful. And I think that that was one of my real stumbling blocks is I never told anyone. My mother knew and my sister knew, but I never told anyone. And I was in therapy for 3 years before I told my closest friends. So at that point, I was in my early 40s and I had never told anyone because I felt ruined. There's no other way to say it. I felt ruined. There's a lot of books out there. One of the great ones is The Body Keeps the Score. The body knows everything that happens to it. So even if you don't have language to articulate what's going on, your body knows what's going on. And you do know what's wrong. I think fundamentally at your core, you know something awful is happening.
Sure. So before you kind of went to therapy, at the age of 38, and obviously you were struggling with kind of all the eating sort of disorder symptoms, did you have a sort of sense did you recognize then that you were carrying some shame, even if you couldn't put your finger on it or quite make sense of where it had come from?
I don't know that it was shame so much as I just felt real inadequacy. I really struggled with whether I was good enough, whether I was smart enough, whether I was pretty enough, whether I worked hard enough, just whether I was good enough. And I think I always came back to that I could do more, better. That is kind of part of my personality too, is that I keep going and going and going, like it's never enough there. So I think that was always there. And I really hated the way I looked, which I think is interesting because you had kind of started out and you were saying something about your body and all the rest of it. And it's like, I think the weight for me served so many purposes. And I felt like I was in therapy with my therapist for 12 years. We did a kind of therapy called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's really interesting. And basically what it does is if you think about your thoughts and feelings run on a train track, and then you have trauma and it's an explosion that blows up the track. So everything is suddenly floating out into space. So nothing makes sense anymore. Nothing's on the track. And it's supposed to kind of help you make sense of things that happen to you so that you can settle them and let them go. And, we would talk round and round and round about my weight, which she did absolutely think was a distraction. But I had so many theories for it. And one of them was my body was the scene of the crime. So what better way to punish myself than through my body? By gaining large amounts of weight, by making sure that I was so hideous, at least in my own mind, that no man would ever want me so I would be safe. That was another big one, is that it's a way to keep yourself safe, even though it tortures you at the same time. And one of the ones I kind of landed on too was I was so tortured by my binges that I got to a point where I was like, I have to learn to forgive myself. If I can't forgive myself for the binge, I can't let it go. I can't move forward. And I got to a point where I thought maybe binging is my way of forgiving myself for what happened, because it becomes a proxy for forgiving myself for my failure.
Yeah, now how interesting. It's so interesting how it all becomes so complex, doesn't it? And almost kind of what's really damaging and punishing is also very soothing and comforting and simultaneously, isn't it?
In your world, especially because you're an eating disorder therapist, food is the one thing that you can never get away from. People can say, I won't drink again, I won't smoke, I won't do this, You can't say that with food. You have to learn to establish some kind of peace with food because it's always going to be part of your life.
Yeah, no, it's so true, isn't
it? And food can be pleasurable. Food is pleasurable.
Yeah, no, sure. And it should be, shouldn't it? But I guess you don't want it to be your one and only soothing strategy, do you?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, sure. So tell us a bit more about your kind of journey in therapy. Like you're talking about you did the EMDR, but was that part of, I guess you did a lot of talking therapy. Was there several different types of therapy that you were doing on that journey?
So when I found my therapist, and I really did look for somebody who specialized in eating disorders, and it just so happened that her background was in trauma and she did EMDR, which I had never heard of. Basically, EMDR is a way to really connect to the emotions. So even if you don't have the words for what you're feeling, your body feels everything. I really was just so closed and so stuck when I started therapy that EMDR is supposed to be very fast. It was not fast for me because you have to be able to feel things, and I could feel nothing. Like I think I had gotten so good at just never feeling anything that when we would try to tap into emotions, there was just nothing there. But it did ultimately prove very successful for me. And again, it's like you learn to, even if there's no words for it, your body feels things. So it's like a somatic experience. And I had a constellation of symptoms when we would talk about things. My arms would go numb. She always speculated because she thought I was pinned down, or it's just like different feelings in the body. But I made a ton of progress with EMDR, and I had been in it, I think, for 6 years, but I still didn't have what I wanted. And when I had started therapy, it's because I really wanted to be in love. I wanted to be in a relationship. I wanted to be with a man. And I just felt like for whatever reason, I couldn't. They weren't attracted to me. I mean, that's what I thought. I started therapy so that I could open myself to love. And within that 3 years of therapy, I'd lost 100 pounds. So it was no longer my weight, but I still couldn't meet anybody. And we couldn't figure out why. And to her great credit, she had said to me, she was like, "You're stuck, but I don't know why or how or on what." So she started exploring all these other alternative therapies that I could try, which I did. And I worked with her throughout. So we did EMDR for 6 years, I believe. And then we did something called chiropractic care, which I had never heard of either. And basically, this is another one, like I'm like, what is this? Again, everything's trapped in the body. So it was a form of chiropractic, but basically it's working on the spinal column, that everything that happens to you needs to be released, or else you're trapped in a perpetual fight or flight response. So it was like smoke and mirrors to me. And I was like, what is this? And it was really interesting because it's based on touch, and I did not like to be touched. I started working with this gentleman who did chiropractic care, and that was when I started to feel emotions, which is so important. And for anybody who takes it for granted that you know how you feel, a lot of people don't know how they feel and can't feel or are afraid to feel. And I would say I was in that camp. I was afraid that if I felt sorrow or grief or sadness or despair, that I would drown in them. And I was very controlling. So emotions were very frightening for me. But it was through his work that I started to feel emotions, and then became the next struggle, which was to learn to identify them, because you need to know what it is that you're feeling so that you can work through it. So it was enormously helpful for me. And I did that for a year and a half, again, with my therapist always guiding me. And then after that, I still didn't have what I wanted. I still didn't have a man. So then I started working with a sex therapist, which I will say, honestly, that one didn't pan out for me. I wasn't active sexually in mind or body, so it was kind of a dead end, but I was not going to leave any stone unturned. I wanted to be with someone, and I wanted to find out, is it just that I'm tortured by what happened or whatever? But that one was less successful for me. And then from there, finally, it was the first thing my therapist suggested when I had first met her. And I said, no, 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 no. She wanted me to go into group therapy. And this is mean, but it's true. So I have lost so much weight over the years. And back in the day, Weight Watchers was the big thing, which I love Weight Watchers. I think they have a very successful program, but you had to go to meetings in person back in the day. You couldn't do it online. It's not like it is today. And I used to hate the meetings because people would go to the meetings and complain that they just want to drink margaritas and eat brownies. I do too, but that's not how you lose weight. I hated the whining. So I never wanted to do group therapy because I thought it would be the same thing. But I had changed so much over the years. I was so much more open that I finally went to group therapy. And it was the first time I met people like me who had similar experiences to me. And my therapist had always wanted me to do it because she was like, I just want you to find community, because you always feel so alone in your experiences. And I have to say, it was a difficult process. It was all difficult. None of it was easy. It was really helpful. And I did ultimately get what I wanted. I did ultimately meet someone. I had managed to become open enough to understand myself well enough that I could open myself to love. But it was 12 years. It took me 12 years.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I really admire your dedication, actually, because you stuck in there, didn't you?
was a mercy. I didn't know it was 12 years. I mean, it was a mercy. I didn't know. And I will say the one thing I didn't mention that I did in there too, that I had started doing was I started meditating, and I've been meditating for more than a decade at this point. And meditation, I felt and still believe all of the things I mentioned were really helpful in their own way. But meditation was the most transformative thing I've done. And I think because meditation is about now, it's about being present. And I was never present. Some people look back. I was always looking forward because I always wanted to anticipate what was going to happen so that I had a strategy in place so that I just didn't like to be surprised. I didn't like tumult. I didn't like not being in control. Meditation, like I said, is really just about now being present, which is where you want to be if you want to be happy and live your life. You want to be present. So.
Yeah, no, so true. I think really inspiring and so helpful for the listeners, I think, as well, to hear that when we go through difficult stuff, sometimes it is a bit of a journey, isn't it? To come out the other side and find that true healing. And it sounds like for you as well, it was kind of incremental stages. Earlier on, you dealt with the more kind of eating side of things, but there was still quite a way to go, wasn't there, with emotions and really connecting with yourself and being open to a relationship and all of those things.
There always was. And I will say too, even though my weight was then at this point manageable, and I've never gained the weight back, thank God, which is the first time in my life where I've maintained the weight loss. It was my go-to in terms of how I could hate myself. I remember what I said, my body was the scene of the crime. And I think that's part of it, the failure of my body to keep me safe. But I also think too that we have such a fixation on the way we look, and that is cultural. That is being female or identifying as female. Like we're very fixated on how we look in this constant comparison to everybody else. And I think it's just so easy to pick yourself apart. And I think the other thing too is that it was the thing I saw all the time. I always saw my body. So I could always find something to hate because of how immersive it is, really, for lack of a better word. I mean, you are with your body all the time. So you constantly see it.
It's really challenging, isn't it? Because if you've already got that kind of real self-loathing, self-criticism, and then it's kind of projected on your body, you just can't escape it, can you? Like you said, it's immersive, it's there all the time. And it's perpetuating, isn't it? Because once you are in that, once you're kind of looking for the faults, body is here, you're going to see them, and you kind of intensifies, doesn't it? And the self-loathing just, yeah, you get very, very trapped.
Yes, I think that you do. I think that you do. Obviously, it's sad and unfortunate. And I will say too that now I can look back and say, obviously, my weight didn't have anything to do with my ability to meet men, but it had everything to do with my ability to meet men, like that I wouldn't allow myself to because I found myself unacceptable. And if it hadn't have been my weight, it would have been something else. It's just like you're using whatever is the most convenient, the most accessible thing to latch on to.
And did you ever sort of struggle with alcohol or anything else, or was it always the food as you're sort of coping?
No, when I was in college, I drank a lot, and I would drink to the point where, I mean, one of the great things about being drunk or being high or whatever is that I was so much more open. So I would end up in these situations with men where I didn't have sex with them, but I had way too many situations where I would suddenly have a moment of lucidity and think, what am I doing? Where am I? And at least I could pull myself out of it. And after college, I had gone to college in Arizona, which is where we had relocated to after my mother divorced. And afterwards, I moved to New York, and I started the same thing. I would go out, I would get wasted, I would hook up with these random guys, but when I wasn't in my little rarefied college environment anymore, it was much more dangerous. And it was at that point where I remember one day I thought it was dangerous, and I stopped going out and I locked myself away because I didn't trust myself. I just didn't trust the situations I would put myself in. And I did that for years. I locked myself away. And I think that's another thing when you were talking about shame. Shame is, again, whether you're ashamed of the way you look or your money or whatever you're ashamed of, once you start to retreat and hide, days go by, years go by, and it becomes harder and harder to get away from it at that point.
Yeah, no, it's very, very isolating, isn't it? And what kind of really brought you to the point at 38 to think, actually, I want to sort of do something about this? And I guess you didn't really know, like you said, the journey you were going to embark on. But was that about the desire for love, or was it about the eating disorder? Was it a mixture of everything?
It really was both. And like I said, I would go through every 2 years, I would gain and lose this weight. And every time I lost it. And again, I was a fantastic dieter because I'm very routinized and I'm also very kind of disciplined. So if I start something, I don't stop. So I really would lose the weight and then always think it was the last time. And then I was never aware when I was gaining it. I should have been, but I wasn't. And it would be like all of a sudden I would kind of have this epiphany and I would be like, oh my God, what happened to me? Suddenly I'm 100 pounds heavier again. What happened? I just was never aware while it was happening. It's exhausting. I mean, I know you know that all too well. It is exhausting. It's exhausting to think about everything you put in your mouth. It's a compulsion. And it occupies every second of your day, which obviously it served a purpose for me because I didn't want to think about things that were worse. And I will say that as tortured as I was by all of that, what I ultimately had to deal with was worse. And I remember I had said to my therapist at one point, I was like, because she was like, the food is a distraction. Your weight is a distraction. You need to deal with what actually happened. And I said to her, I was like, I never think about the abuse ever, but I think about the fatness all the time. And she's like, yeah, but think about it. Doesn't the fatness feel the way the abuse should? You feel gross. You feel disgusting. You feel unacceptable. So even if you never think about it, you feel it every moment of every day. And I did. I felt that kind of loathing and that just ruin every second of every day. It's just that my weight became, like you said, the metaphor for it.
Time for a short advertisement break. Are you a counsellor, dietitian, therapist, nutritionist, personal trainer, or other mental health professional? Are you seeing increasing numbers of your clients struggling with eating disorders and disordered eating? And are you keen to learn skills and strategies and build confidence in working with your clients who struggle with these issues? We know that increasing numbers of people are struggling with eating disorders, and we know that 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight, and this means that many eating disorder symptoms are hidden. The Good Childhood Report in 2021 highlights appearance as a leading cause of unhappiness among young people and indicates that appearance concerns are increasing year upon year. So join my Eating Disorders Training Day on Zoom, face-to-face, or self-paced online. It will give you a really good understanding about the different types of eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and OSFED, with an introduction to RFED and neurodiversity and eating disorders. You'll explore typical causes of eating disorders and understand how to create a psychological formulation for your client, and this will be brought to you by relating to client examples. I will take you through them, my specific knowledge, skills, and techniques, which can be used when supporting clients with eating disorders. You will get a full comprehensive training manual and access to the recording of the training afterwards and a full online version of the course. If you want to sign up, please go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk, and you might also be interested in my body image training for professionals too.
Yeah, no, so interesting, isn't it? And when you're sort of talking about it now, and it sounds much more clear, doesn't it? But at the time, you just would have been in a complete fog, wouldn't you?
Like I said, when I first met with her and we went through my history and she was like, it was about your childhood sexual abuse. And I was like, what? How could that be? It's not. And she's like, you know, it is. It is. And she was right. It was. It was. But again, and even now, I don't think it's much better. There's just nothing out there that really says, hey, if you have X problem, it could be because of this. I mean, it's a little better now, but it really is to know this too. But as an eating disorder therapist, different kind of eating disorders manifest based on different things. Binge eating, which is what I did, is very common for children who have been sexually abused. And I think it's probably because it's readily available. Food is readily available, unless you're unfortunate enough not to have food. And that's a lot of people in our world. But if you do have access to food, I mean, what else do you have access to when you're young? Some people have access to drugs and alcohol, which is terrible. And I think food too is still so normal. You don't think anything of seeing, I'm going to stick with women just because I'm female. And I think it's so common to see women go out to eat and just go out to eat cake or whatever. Or even if, I don't know if you ever watched the show, The Golden Girls, but what would they do? They would break out the cheesecake. I mean, it's so acceptable. It's so part of our norm.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, it's very easy for it to be hidden, isn't it, actually? But it can feel like it's the one thing that's yours in a way behind closed doors. And then when you are out in the world, it might appear that you are coping almost. What about, Patty, like you said, when you started to really feel those emotions, it was really, really challenging. How did you kind of get through that? Obviously, you were seeing your therapist, but were there particular things that really helped you with that particular phase of when you were becoming much more connected with your body?
Well, it's interesting. So at that time, I was doing this thing called chiropractic care. And again, it's based on touch. And there were all kinds of things, like it was a bizarre kind of therapy for me. I was just not at all familiar with it. But again, I wasn't familiar with any of the things I embarked upon. But one of the things that happened was he would work on multiple people at once. And there were people who were kind of very quiet, like I was, and there were people that were not quiet. And it was very, very unsettling and scary for me. And ultimately, he ended up seeing me alone because I like to hear other people emoting, and it was just very triggering for me. So he and I actually became very close because I saw him 3 times a week. We did this therapy that I didn't understand how it worked, but it did. And I started feeling all these emotions. And while most of the time I was nice, it got to a point where I felt like I was biting and cruel. He really became my target. The more I felt, the more vulnerable I felt, the more exposed I felt, the more I would lash out at him because I was just so unhappy with really how vulnerable I felt. So I remember I was just tortured by how mean I was to him or how mean I perceived myself to be to him, that it got to a point where I had to talk to him just to alleviate the guilt that I felt. So he and I had set up time to talk, and I apologized. I was like, I'm so mean. I'm so this, I'm so that, blah, 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 blah. And there was nothing in my world worse than crying in front of somebody. And I had been in therapy a long time before I cried in front of my therapist. It was just, I felt too exposed. I felt too vulnerable. And while I didn't cry when I was with him, my eyes were full of tears. And he listened to me apologize and tell him what I thought I needed to say. And then he said to me, he was like, look at how far you've come, that you could tell me how you feel. He was like, I'm so proud of you. And he was like, I know that this whole experience is terrifying for you. And he's like, and feeling emotions is frightening. It's like an eggshell cracking, but still you come back for every visit. And he's like, you're doing it and you're doing it so well. Never worry about how your growth affects me. You're not mean to me. I mean, he was great, but he did say to me, I want you to understand that you can be in control without being controlling and vulnerable without being powerless. And I was like, oh my God, I don't think that's possible.
Mm.
But it is possible. It is possible. But for me, I was like, wow, how would you do
Mm.
that? So I
Yeah.
thought he was really, I don't know how what he did worked, but it did work. I feel like without him, he really enabled me to feel. And then once I could feel, it made my therapy go better with my therapist because I had things that I could latch onto how I felt. And again, like I said, being able to name your emotions is so key because she used to say to me, she was like, now that you know what it is, she's like, you need to just let yourself feel it so it can wash through you and past you. When you just try and resist it with everything in you, you get stuck. But if you just let yourself feel it, it will pass. And it's true, but you have to be able to let yourself feel it and trust that you won't drown.
Sure. Yeah. I just think incredibly inspiring that work that you did. And because I'm just so admire your determination and persistence in going back again and again, because it sounds like it was really difficult, challenging work. And obviously it's got you to this place now where you are in a relationship and you're free and it's so much better place. But I guess sounds like a very bumpy road, really. And you would have felt very unsafe a lot of times on that road.
It really, really was uncomfortable. And I am not currently in a relationship, but I am still hopeful that I will find the right person for me. I mean, it really was. It was very, very difficult. And I would say, but just as you said, it's iterative. Every day was a little bit better than the day before. And that's kind of what keeps you going. It's not a zero-sum game where suddenly you're broken and then you're whole. You make gains every day, and every day was a little bit happier. And that's what kept me going. I think one of the blessings, there's a few that came out of this. One is that I'm very, very fortunate that I do live in a big city where you can access just about anything. Therapies I had never heard of and I had no exposure to. I'm lucky that I had health insurance and some of it was covered by my health insurance, but not having any money shouldn't deter people either because there's so many great resources out there now. But I consider myself very, very fortunate that any personality trait, even if it's not innate, can be learned, but I am naturally very resilient and tenacious. And those two things really kept me going. You get knocked down, you get back up. That's just the way I'm built, but a lot of people aren't. And it's scary stuff. And you have to trust that it's going to be worth it. And I will say that is another personality trait of mine. I am definitely underneath everything, there was always hope. There was always hope that I could be fixed, that I could get what I wanted, and it kept me going. And, if those things are not innate to you, there's that saying, fake it till you make it, because you put a smile on your face every day, at some point it becomes natural. It's like you just have to force yourself through it in the early days to think, I'm going to get better, I'm going to get better, I'm going to get better. And then someday you'll start to believe.
And I think that hope piece is really important, isn't it? Because I was thinking, in a way, if you're hopeful and you believe that recovery is possible, in a way, you will keep pursuing the exits, won't you? When you hit another dead end, like you say, you pick yourself up and try again.
And it's really important to remember, too, that success is not a straight line. Yeah. What is the saying? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That happens all the time. And while I never regained a ton of weight, my weight would toggle 15, 20 pounds. And let me tell you, 20 pounds can be as much as 100 when you're in a bad place. 10 pounds can seem like 100 when you're not in a good place. I mean, it's enough to throw your world, plunge it into darkness. And I think that I had said to you before that I questioned, did I binge so that I could forgive myself? And again, forgiving myself for what happened to me as a child. But I think there is this whole notion about giving yourself a measure of grace, that even if things don't go the way you hope, that you're not perfect, that it's taking longer than you want, you can't do anything until you're ready to. And my therapist, I used to say, when am I going to be done? When am I going to be done? She was like, I don't know. Nobody knows. You don't know. I don't know. And yet, no, we did not know it was going to be 12 years until I was done. But was it 12 years well spent? It really, really was. Sure. I mean, I got to the other side and lots of people don't. I'm very, very fortunate that I was able to see it through and had the resources and the wherewithal to just keep going.
Sure. So, Patty, I guess for anyone listening that really sort of relates to your story, and maybe they've suffered some sexual abuse themselves and they're struggling with food, and maybe they haven't told anyone, or they're feeling quite isolated, what would you say kind of first steps really for anyone listening?
I would say first and foremost, no matter what happened to you, it's not your fault. That's the first thing and the most fundamental thing and the hardest thing for me to accept, was that it wasn't my fault. So I think, again, you might not believe it, but God willing, someday you will. It is not your fault. It is never your fault. I don't care if you're 17, you're still a child. An adult is an adult. A child is a child. The adult is always the one who's making the decisions. Again, no matter what happened to you, if you're a child, it's not your fault. That's number one. Second one is, if you have anybody in your life you think you can talk to, a teacher, a postman, anybody that you're friendly with, who you trust, just tell somebody, anybody. And if you feel like you can't, there are so many resources now. RAINN, it's RAINN.org. It's rape, abuse, incest. They have resources. Harriet, I know you'd be a great person for a million resources for people who struggle with food, but one of the ones here also is the National Association of Eating Disorders, NEDA.org. They're another one. They'll connect you to resources. And there's so many. Just do a deep dive on the internet, because there's so many free resources where they'll connect you to people who can help you. And even if you don't feel like you can do therapy or whatever else, just sometimes reading about other people's stories, connect with a group on Facebook. There's so many anonymous places where you can meet other people like you who understand how you feel, so that you don't need to feel so alone. And that would be the other thing too. Don't give up if you're like, wow, I can't believe she's talking about it. I never thought. I would have said I would sooner be the Queen of England than I would have ever told anybody that I was sexually abused as a child. I thought the shame would kill me. I changed. That's the beautiful thing about life, if you're lucky enough to keep on going, is that people can change if they want to. So just because you can't do something today doesn't mean you can't do it tomorrow.
Yeah, no, encouraging words. Thank you. Patty, where can people find you if they want to perhaps read more about your story, maybe get in touch with you? Where's the best resource?
The best place is my website. It's www.patty.cabot.com. And one of the things you can find on my website is my book. It's called Not That Girl Anymore. It's a memoir, and it really does go through all the different kinds of therapies I tried. So it's kind of that 12-year period of me starting therapy. So it's about my weight, EMDR, chiropractic care, sex therapy, group therapy, meditation, and when I finally find the relationship that I want. And that is available for free on my website. You can download it for free. Also on my website is a resources page, which talks a little bit about each of the therapies that we discussed. So if somebody's interested in what is this EMDR, it kind of gives you a couple of paragraphs about it, and then where you might be able to find a therapist for yourself. And again, if you're interested in any of the therapies I talked about, my book, which is interesting, I was so closed when I started therapy, but there was so much happening and it was so hard for me to process. A writer, I do communications consulting, but I would come home from my sessions and I would write down what happened as a way for me to make sense of them. And I did it for 12 years. And when I finally had this relationship, I thought, oh my God, I should write a book. I have all the raw material. So everything in my book is true. It really is what happened in my sessions and kind of the different epiphanies I made, and really goes through kind of what it's like to do EMDR, be in group therapy, go to a sex therapist, whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, goodness me. I mean, how fascinating actually, because pretty quite rare to have such detail in the moment resource actually of someone taking account of what was going on at the time. So sounds incredible. I mean, I'll definitely make sure your book as well, we'll put that in the show notes with your website, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that'll be really, really interested actually to hear more about your experiences in sort of depth.
Thank you. And I will say one more thing I want to make sure that I point out, because you were like, what would you say to people? One of the things I would say to people is, for everybody who's like me, meaning you're fighting the same battle repeatedly and you don't know why, or you're not making traction, I would say if that sounds like you are likely not dealing with the root cause, just as I was not dealing with the root cause. So again, whatever your struggle may be, like if you just can't seem to keep the weight off, but you can take it off, but you can't keep, there's something else at play. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper to find out what's driving the behavior.
Yeah, no, it's so true, isn't it? And I think the National Association for Eating Disorders in the UK always says it's not about food, it's about feelings. But the food and the weight can absolutely preoccupy you, can't it? 24/7, really. It's hard to see.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's often a lot more beneath.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Patty, for coming on the podcast and for sharing your story. I think incredibly inspiring. I think it's will give people an awful lot of hope. I definitely kind of feel I've absorbed some of your resilience and tenacity and how you approach things. I think in this kind of quick fix world, we often want the 8-week plan, don't we? We don't realize sometimes that these things take time. And I think it's really helpful for people to hear the reality of what it is sometimes to really heal. But that's okay, isn't it? It's all a journey. And I guess ultimately you are where you are today from going along this road. So
thank you. And it is funny because I think, again, the world has changed so much since I started my journey. But one of the great things about, I think, where I ended up is I really do understand myself now. So I don't have to forgive myself if I overeat. To tie it back to food, if I'm eating something delicious and I want more, it's a choice I'm making. And that's okay for me to make that choice. Food isn't inherently good or bad. If I feel like, wow, this is lovely and I want another few bites, then by golly, I can have it. And I don't need to forgive myself for it because I'm making a choice. It doesn't just happen. It's not out of my awareness. And I think that's really key, whatever it is you're doing, particularly around food. You're making choices as opposed to feeling powerless.
Yeah, no, sure. And that's a great way to end, isn't it, really? Because I think that's where we all want to be, isn't it? Feeling actually from an empowered place of choice rather than feeling driven by all these external things that we don't understand.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Patty. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Harriet. You have been so generous and kind, and I very much appreciate you having me on here with you.
Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. Do go and check out all of Patty's details in the show notes. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out at the Eating Disorder Therapist _. And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. You might also want to check out my Substack, where you can read articles and stories about eating disorders, along with audios that accompany this. The link is in the show notes. And if you enjoy this podcast, I would be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.